A millionaire rescues 3 abandoned babies by a lake near his mansion. Days later, gunshots ring out throughout his mansion, leaving him deeply regretting his actions. The storm had not yet broken, but the sky was heavy with the promise of it. Thick clouds swirled in sluggish turmoil, their weight pressing down upon the Lancaster estate like an omen. In the distance, lightning cracked through the horizon, illuminating the vast stretch of land that lay in obedient silence around the mansion. The air smelled of rain, of wet earth waiting to be drenched, but inside, everything remained untouched, eerily still. Adrian Lancaster stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his study, the amber liquid in his glass, reflecting the dim light from the fireplace. He hadn't taken a sip. It sat in his grip like an afterthought, his fingers wrapped tightly around the crystal, knuckles tense but controlled. Outside, raindrops began tapping against the glass, light at first, like hesitant fingertips, before gaining confidence, falling in rhythmic succession. His reflection in the glass was sharp and unforgiving. He looked at himself, but did not recognize the man staring back. The years had carved shadows into his face, deepened the creases around his eyes, and made his presence in a room feel heavier. He had built walls around himself and fortified them with discipline, wealth, and an ironclad reputation. But even walls had weak spots. A faint creak broke the silence. His gaze flicked toward the hallway. He hadn't been in that room in years, but tonight, for some reason, his feet carried him there. The door was closed, as it always had been. His hand hovered over the knob. He didn't turn it. He knew what lay beyond. The bed, still made, the bookshelves still lined with children's classics, a half-finished puzzle on the desk that would never be completed. Dust had settled over everything, muting the past into something distant, but not distant enough. He could still hear it, that final echo of laughter, before it was silenced forever. His fingers tightened, then withdrew. The past was always waiting, just behind a door he refused to open. Turning away, Adrian forced himself back down the hall, back toward the study, back toward the present. But the feeling followed him like a ghost. The lake was restless tonight, the surface rippling under the weight of the wind. The storm was drawing closer, but Adrian walked anyway, his hands deep in the pockets of his coat, his gaze unfocused. The rain hadn't yet reached its full force, but the damp air clung to him, cool and heavy. It was supposed to be a quiet walk. He came out here when the house became suffocating, when the weight of things unspoken pressed too heavily against his ribs. Out here, the world did not ask him questions. But tonight, something was different. A sound. Faint, almost lost in the wind. Adrian stopped, his entire body going still. He turned his head slightly, listening. It came again, soft, broken, barely there. His first instinct was to ignore it. His second was to walk away. But something in the air shifted. A pull, deep in his gut, made his feet move before he had time to question it. He followed the sound, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The reeds near the water swayed wildly, bending under the wind's force, but he pushed through them, his pulse slow and steady. And then he saw it. A basket, old, worn, barely held together. Inside, barely distinguishable under a soaked, tattered blanket, were 3 impossibly small figures. Adrian stared. The wind howled around him, but everything else had fallen into absolute silence. The smallest one stirred, a tiny fist breaking free from the damp fabric. The fingers flexed, reaching, searching. Before he realized what he was doing, Adrian extended a hand. The tiny fingers wrapped around his own, and for the first time in years, something in his chest shifted. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A choice. He could leave them here, walk away, forget. But he knew, deep in his heart, that he wouldn't. Lifting the basket, feeling the fragile weight of their existence settle into his arms, Adrian turned back toward the mansion. The storm broke behind him. The mansion was unusually restless that night. Somewhere deep within its grand halls, the distant hum of a baby's cry seeped through thick walls, threading its way into the heavy silence that had once been absolute. The staff, though trained to mask their emotions, exchanged uncertain glances, their quiet steps purposeful but hesitant. The presence of 3 abandoned infants had unsettled the estate in ways no external threat ever had. In his study, Adrian Lancaster stood motionless by the fireplace, his hands pressed firmly against the edge of the mantel. Shadows flickered across the sharp angles of his face, the glow from the flames carving deep lines into his features. The amber liquid in his glass remained untouched, the ice melting into thin rivulets along the rim. Outside, rain continued to lash against the windows, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the storm inside his mind. "Mr. Lancaster, Dr. Reinhardt is on his way," Martin, his chief of staff, informed him, with the same practiced calm he always carried. He hesitated just for a second before adding, "Shall I have the nursery prepared?" Adrian's grip on the glass tightened. "No," he said after a long pause, his voice measured, distant. "They're not staying." Martin nodded once, but there was something in his expression, something unreadable. He had served Adrian for years, had witnessed him navigate ruthless business negotiations, had seen his silence become a weapon sharper than words. But tonight, for the first time, uncertainty lingered in the air between them. The hallway outside the guest suite was dimly lit, the sconces casting long shadows that wavered against the walls. Adrian stood there, unmoving, listening. The cries had subsided into soft, uneven breaths, the kind that came from exhaustion rather than comfort. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air as Dr. Reinhardt worked methodically, murmuring to the head housekeeper about fever risks and fluid intake. Adrian exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The sound of an infant crying. It had been years since he had heard it this close. And yet, the weight of it pressed against his ribs, as if it had never left. "He's just hungry, Adrian. Hold him for a second." "I'll be right back." His breath hitched, his jaw tensed. He forced the memory away. Dr. Reinhardt stepped out of the room then, wiping his hands on a small cloth before slipping it into his bag. The man was in his 60s, sharp-eyed, observant, and too perceptive for his own good. He studied Adrian for a beat before speaking. "They're healthy, considering the circumstances," the doctor said. "Malnourished, but nothing irreversible. They're lucky you found them when you did." Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "I want them taken care of properly, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly, already knowing what he wanted to say but unable to find the right words. Dr. Reinhardt watched him, the weight of years between them making silence more telling than words. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said finally, his tone softer, less clinical. "But if you were going to send them away, you wouldn't have called me." The words landed heavier than Adrian expected. The doctor turned to leave, pausing only once. "They won't cry forever, you know, just until they feel safe." Adrian remained in the dim hallway long after Reinhardt had gone. Later, in his office, the TV droned on in the background, the voices of news anchors filling the space with reports of financial markets and political debates. Adrian sat behind his desk, his fingers tapping idly against the polished wood, his mind far from the numbers displayed on the screen. Then, a shift in tone. Breaking news. An international child trafficking ring linked to the criminal organization known as Black Serpent has been dismantled after a coordinated raid late last night. Authorities believe this is just the beginning, as further investigations unfold. The image on the screen changed, a grainy photo of a dimly lit warehouse, followed by rows of children being escorted to safety. His jaw locked. The ice in his untouched drink had long since melted, the condensation pooling onto the desk. Adrian reached for the remote and switched the TV off. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, he did nothing, just sat there, staring at nothing in particular. Then, almost unconsciously, he stood and walked toward the guest suite. He didn't step inside. He didn't need to. Through the small gap in the door, he could see the smallest of the infants, bundled in layers of blankets, his tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Something in Adrian's throat tightened. Without thinking, he reached forward, adjusting the edge of the blanket, tucking it in more securely. And then, just as quickly as he had come, he turned and walked away. The rain had thickened into a curtain of silver, falling in relentless sheets against the estate's vast grounds. The storm, which had been only a distant rumble a few hours ago, had now settled in full force, sending icy gusts through the trees and rattling against the windows like impatient fingers. The estate, though fortified against the elements, felt smaller somehow, its walls unable to keep the tempest entirely at bay. Adrian sat in his study, the dim firelight casting flickering shadows against the leather-bound books lining the walls. The glass of whiskey beside him remained untouched. He had not switched the TV back on since the news report about Black Serpent. Instead, the silence pressed against him, stretching too long, too heavy. Then came the pounding, a fist striking the front door with the kind of desperation that didn't hesitate, that had nothing left to lose. Once, twice, a third time. The staff hesitated. Martin had already reached for the security panel, his fingers hovering over the controls, awaiting Adrian's signal. Adrian didn't move for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Open it." Martin exchanged a glance with another staff member before unlocking the front door. It burst inward with the force of the wind. And there, barely standing, drenched and trembling, was a woman. She was soaked to the bone, her hair clinging to her face, her lips tinged pale from the cold. The rain had darkened her clothes, making it impossible to tell where fabric ended and skin began. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, her body swaying unsteadily before her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the marble floor. For a moment, no one moved. The rain dripped from her onto the pristine white stone, pooling beneath her like ink spreading over paper. And then, weakly, her lips parted. Where are they?" Adrian's eyes narrowed. The staff murmured among themselves, waiting for his reaction. A woman appearing out of nowhere, in the middle of a storm, asking for the children. It was not a coincidence. He rose from his chair. His steps were measured as he approached, his gaze assessing. The sharp angles of her face were marred with bruises, the corner of her lip cracked and barely healed. The exhaustion in her eyes was not just from lack of sleep. It was from running. She was afraid. But of what? Or who? "Bring Dr. Reinhardt," he ordered. Then, looking down at her, his voice quieter but no less firm, "Get her out of the rain." The warmth of the fireplace in the drawing room did little to ease the chill that had settled into Evelyn Carter's bones. She sat curled in one of the oversized armchairs, a blanket draped around her shoulders. Despite the fire crackling behind her, her hands still trembled faintly. Her eyes, hollowed by exhaustion, remained fixed on the flames, unfocused. Adrian stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching. He had not spoken to her directly yet, allowing Dr. Reinhardt to assess her first. The physician had removed his gloves, slipping them into his medical bag with the air of a man who had seen far worse, but was not entirely at ease. "She's dehydrated, exhausted. Her injuries aren't fresh, but they weren't treated properly either." He glanced at Adrian meaningfully. "She's been running for a while." Adrian didn't react. He was aware of the weight of Martin's stare, the silent question lingering between them. Who was this woman, and why had she come here? Finally, he broke the silence. "She claims to know the children." At that, Evelyn stirred. Her fingers curled into the fabric of the blanket, tightening as she turned her head toward him. "I don't just know them," she rasped, her voice raw, barely above a whisper. "They're mine." The words dropped into the room like stones into deep water, sinking, spreading ripples of tension. Adrian said nothing. Dr. Reinhardt glanced between them, but wisely chose not to interfere. After a long pause, he simply nodded to himself, packing the last of his instruments before standing. "She needs rest. I doubt she'll run, but I'll leave a mild sedative in case she refuses." His gaze flickered toward Adrian one last time. "Don't push her too soon. If you want the truth, let her tell it when she's ready." With that, the doctor left, closing the door behind him. Now, it was just Adrian and Evelyn. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence that stretched between them. Adrian's expression was unreadable, his stance unmoving. The weight of his scrutiny made Evelyn's skin prickle, but she refused to shrink beneath it. "You left them," he finally said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And now you've come back." Evelyn swallowed. "I didn't want to leave them." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Then why did you?" Her throat tightened. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them, locking her gaze onto his. "Because I had no choice." The air in the room shifted. Adrian had spent a lifetime knowing when someone was lying. It was in the way they avoided eye contact, the way their voice faltered at the wrong moment, the way their hands twitched with barely restrained nervousness. But Evelyn, she was not lying. Something in her eyes, something raw, something shattered, told him that whatever she had run from was worse than abandoning her own children. Still, he would not let himself be convinced so easily. "Explain," he said. She hesitated only for a second before taking a slow, shuddering breath. "Victor Morrow," she said. The name sliced through the space between them, sharp, deliberate. Adrian's fingers curled against his palm. He knew that name. He had heard it spoken in darkened rooms, in hushed voices over the years. Victor Morrow was not just a criminal. He was a tactician, a businessman in the most ruthless sense, and more than that, a figure deeply entwined with the Black Serpent. Evelyn saw the flicker in Adrian's expression, brief but telling. She swallowed hard. "Then you know." Adrian remained silent. Of course he knew. He had known monsters like Victor Morrow before. But what he didn't know, what sent a cold sensation creeping down his spine, was why this woman, this storm-drenched stranger, had just walked into his life, holding a past that wasn't just hers, but his as well. The night stretched long after Evelyn had spoken that name. Victor Morrow. The syllables carried weight, a history Adrian had deliberately left untouched. He had spent years severing his past from his present, ensuring no remnants of that world bled into the empire he had built. And yet, here it was, spilling from the lips of a woman who had collapsed at his doorstep, drenched in rain and desperation. Adrian didn't react immediately. He let the silence settle, let the firelight flicker across his unreadable expression as he studied Evelyn. She was still trembling, though whether from the cold or the exhaustion he wasn't sure. "Your name," he finally said. She hesitated, as if the question caught her off guard. "Evelyn," she murmured, her voice rough and strained. "Evelyn Carter." A pause. "And you?" Adrian arched a brow slightly at the question. She had sought him out, had come here with some level of knowledge about him, and yet she was only asking now. "Adrian Lancaster." Something flickered in her gaze. Recognition. He didn't need her to say it. They both knew the kind of men who had whispered his name in the past. He moved toward the side table, pouring steaming tea from the porcelain pot the staff had left earlier. The sound of liquid filling the cup was the only thing punctuating the quiet. He placed it in front of her. "Drink," he said. She eyed it warily. He could see the instinct of caution, of years spent anticipating traps, but eventually she reached for it. Her hand still shook as she lifted the cup to her lips. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain outside had eased into a steady patter against the windows, no longer the violent downpour from before, but a quiet, persistent presence. Then, finally, "My father sold me to him," Evelyn said. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his fingers laced together as he observed her. He didn't interrupt. She exhaled, a slow, uneven breath. "My father was a gambler, the kind who never knew when to stop. It got bad enough that when the debt piled high, when they finally came knocking, he had nothing left to give." Her lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "So he gave me." Adrian didn't flinch, though something cold slithered through him. "I was barely 20. She set the cup down with deliberate care, though her fingers were still curled around it. "Victor doesn't take what isn't useful to him. He didn't just want to own me, he wanted to shape me. I was a commodity, an investment, and I played along because there was no other option." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Until..." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Until I overheard something I wasn't meant to." She looked at him then, and this time, there was no hesitation, no pause in her words. "He didn't just want me. He wanted children. Not for sentiment, not for family, but for what they could be, what they were made to be." Adrian remained still. Evelyn's hands clenched around the fabric of the blanket draped over her shoulders. "Victor doesn't consider them his children," she said quietly. "He considers them his creation, his investment, and he won't stop until he gets them back." The words sat heavy between them. Adrian tapped a finger against the armrest of his chair, his expression giving away nothing. "Why?" Evelyn swallowed. "Because they were never meant to be ordinary. Victor was involved in something bigger, something deeper. Genetic modifications, biological enhancements, things that go far beyond what should be possible. Black Serpent funded the research, but Victor was the one pulling the strings." Adrian said nothing. He didn't need to. He had spent years distancing himself from that world, but that didn't mean he had forgotten what it was capable of. And now, it was no longer just some distant crime syndicate operating in the shadows. Now, it was here, inside his home, inside the eyes of a woman who sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket, clutching a cup of tea as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. He studied her carefully. "You expect me to believe all of this?" Evelyn didn't waver. "I don't expect anything from you," she said, "but I know Victor. I know what he's willing to do. I know what he's done." She inhaled sharply. "And I know that if you don't believe me now, you will soon." Adrian held her gaze. There were no theatrics in her words, no over-exaggeration, no dramatics, just quiet, relentless certainty. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. For years, he had chosen his battles carefully. He had built his life on calculated risks, on a power that no longer required bloodshed. He had turned his back on the past, and he had done so deliberately. But this wasn't about business. This wasn't about empire building or settling old scores. This was about 3 children, barely clinging to life when he found them, and a woman who had risked everything to come back for them. Adrian exhaled, slow and measured. "For the sake of argument," he said, his voice quiet, deliberate, "let's assume I believe you." He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "What is it you want from me?" Evelyn's fingers tightened around the fabric of the blanket. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I just want to keep them safe." The words rang through the room with quiet finality. Adrian studied her for a long moment before finally leaning back. His gaze flickered toward the fireplace, the flames casting long shadows against the walls. For the first time in years, he found himself pulled into something not out of power, not out of obligation, not even out of revenge, but because it reminded him of loss, of something stolen, and of something that, maybe, just maybe, could still be protected. The mansion was quiet, but it was not at peace. The storm had passed, leaving behind damp earth and the scent of rain lingering in the air, yet the tension within the estate walls remained, thick and pressing. Adrian had not slept, though sleep had long ceased to be a necessity for him. It was a luxury, an indulgence he had learned to forego. Instead, he sat in his study, the dim glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. The ice in his untouched whiskey had melted. He didn't bother to move the glass. His mind replayed Evelyn's words. Victor doesn't consider them his children. He considers them his investment. She wasn't lying. He was pretty certain about that. But certainty did not make the situation any less dangerous. Adrian exhaled slowly and stood, moving toward the large security console built into the wall. With the press of a button, a series of surveillance feeds flickered to life across the screen. The estate's perimeter was lined with motion sensors, infrared cameras, and guards stationed at key locations. Yet, despite its defenses, he had learned long ago, nothing was ever truly impenetrable. And then, at precisely 3:42 a.m., the alarms triggered. The motion sensors near the western fence flared red. Adrian's posture remained unchanged, but something in his expression hardened. His fingers moved over the control panel, switching the feed. The cameras adjusted, focusing in on the disturbance. 3 men, moving low, masked, armed. They were trained, but not trained well enough. Their steps were careful, but not cautious enough. Adrian watched in silence as his security team responded with quiet efficiency. His men moved like shadows, emerging from the tree line, surrounding the intruders before they had a chance to react. It was over in less than 2 minutes. One of the masked men attempted to flee, but a well-placed strike from Martin sent him sprawling into the damp earth. A boot pressed into his back, forcing him still. The others were already unconscious, their weapons stripped away. Adrian turned away from the screen. He didn't need to watch the rest. "Bring one inside," he instructed, his voice calm. "Make sure he's awake." The basement of the estate was rarely used. It was a relic of the mansion's history, built in another time, for another purpose. Stone walls, thick and unforgiving. No windows. Only the hum of the overhead light broke the silence. The man was bound to a chair, his mask removed, revealing a face slick with sweat and dirt. His lip was split, and one eye was already swelling from the force of Martin's earlier strike. He was breathing heavily, but not out of fear, out of defiance. Adrian stepped into the dim light, his presence quiet but absolute. For a long moment he didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle into the man's bones. There were no threats, no unnecessary displays of violence, just a single unwavering stare. And then, finally, "Who sent you?" The man spat blood onto the floor. "You already know." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Do I?" A bitter smirk. "Victor always takes back what belongs to him." Adrian's patience snapped. The strike came fast, quicker than the man could react. A sharp crack echoed through the room as Adrian's fist connected with his jaw, snapping his head to the side. The chair groaned under the force. Adrian didn't wait for him to recover. He leaned in, his voice low and steady. "I don't care what Victor thinks belongs to him. What I care about is the message you're going to send back." The man coughed, laughing hoarsely. "You think you're untouchable? You think this house, these guards, mean anything to him? He'll burn it all down. He'll take what's his, and then he'll—" Adrian cut him off with a brutal grip to his throat. The man choked, his hands straining against the bindings. But Adrian didn't squeeze, just held him there, held him long enough to let the panic set in, to let the understanding sink deep. "I want you to remember something," Adrian murmured, his tone almost thoughtful. The only reason you're still breathing is because I need you to deliver a message." The man's eyes widened slightly. "Tell Victor that if he comes for them, he won't get another warning." Adrian released him abruptly. The man gasped, coughing violently as he sucked in air. "Let him go," Adrian instructed, stepping back. "Make sure he finds his way home." Martin nodded, already moving to comply. The guards lifted the man to his feet, dragging him toward the exit. Adrian exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of the moment. He had hoped there would be time to plan, time to understand. But Victor had just made it clear. Time was no longer a luxury they had. Evelyn was waiting in the hall when Adrian emerged. She had changed out of her damp clothes, her face slightly less pale, but her eyes were sharp. She had heard the commotion. "It was him, wasn't it?" she asked quietly. Adrian met her gaze. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Her hands clenched into fists. "He won't stop." "I know." She exhaled sharply. "Then we have to leave." Adrian shook his head. "Not we. You." Her expression darkened. "No." Adrian's voice was quiet, but there was no room for argument. "You lost your right to argue the moment you left them in the woods." Evelyn flinched as if struck. For a long moment she just stared at him, her jaw tight, her breath unsteady. Then, just as quickly, she turned away. Adrian watched her go, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he pulled out his phone. "Fuel the jet," he ordered. "We're leaving within the hour." There was no time left for hesitation. Victor had made his move. Now it was Adrian's turn. The wind howled through the valley, whispering through the thick pines that surrounded the estate like sentinels. The sky was a heavy shade of slate, streaked with the last remnants of storm clouds retreating into the horizon. The world beyond the private airstrip was eerily quiet, save for the steady hum of Adrian's private jet cooling after its descent. Evelyn stood on the tarmac, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, though the chill in the air had nothing to do with her shivering. Behind her, the children had been carried inside, bundled in thick blankets, their small bodies swallowed by the oversized fabric. The estate loomed in the distance, isolated, fortified, and forgotten by the world. Adrian had chosen this place deliberately. It was a relic from another life, a safe house he had built long before he ever considered leaving that world behind. Tucked away in the mountains, protected by layers of security, it was a fortress. And like all fortresses, it had ghosts. She felt him before she saw him, his presence as imposing as ever. "You should rest," he said, his voice even, impersonal. Evelyn turned, searching his face for something, anything, but found nothing but cold indifference. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured. "I know what I've put you through." Adrian's gaze flicked to her, impassive. "I didn't do this for you." The words cut sharper than she expected. For a moment, she wanted to push back, to argue, to remind him that she hadn't asked for this. But the exhaustion in his stance told her it wouldn't matter. Adrian Lancaster was a man who made decisions on his own terms. If she was here, it was because he allowed it. Nothing more. A part of her wished she could hate him for it. Instead, she nodded, turning toward the estate. "Where will you be?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. Then quietly, "Making sure no one followed us." And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows like he had been made for them. The estate was a masterpiece of steel and stone, standing against the wilderness with an air of quiet dominance. Inside, it was built for function rather than comfort. Clean lines, reinforced glass, state-of-the-art security systems. It was the kind of place meant to keep people out, not let them in. Evelyn stood in the nursery, watching as the children were settled. The staff Adrian had called ahead were efficient but gentle, moving through their routines with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. She swallowed hard. This should have brought her relief. They were safe. For now. But the moment she let her guard down, the moment she breathed, she would remember. This wasn't over. Victor would come. She turned away, pressing her palm to her forehead. The weight of everything threatened to collapse on top of her. And then, just barely, she heard it. Footsteps, not the hurried, calculated ones of the staff, not Adrian's steady, measured presence, something smaller, softer. Evelyn turned. One of the children, Noah, stood in the doorway, his tiny fingers curled around the frame, wide eyes watching her with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Her breath caught. He was so small, too small. She had missed so much time. Her throat tightened. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered. Noah didn't answer. He didn't run to her, didn't reach for her. He simply stood there, as if waiting. Evelyn felt her knees weaken, but before she could say anything else, one of the nannies appeared, scooping Noah up effortlessly. "Come on, little one," she cooed, carrying him away. Time for bed. Evelyn watched as he disappeared down the hall. Would they ever know her? Or had she lost them the moment she left them behind? Adrian hadn't meant to stop. He had every intention of heading straight to his security room, scanning the perimeter, reinforcing the defenses. But something pulled him toward the nursery. He told himself it was precautionary, a final check, a habit. Yet, as he stood there, leaning against the doorway, watching the rise and fall of their tiny chests, he felt something else entirely. A quiet unease. They were so small. And for the first time, he wondered if this was a mistake. Not the safe house, not the security, but his involvement. These children, they weren't his to protect. They weren't his responsibility. He had stepped into this because of circumstance, because of Evelyn, because of a name from his past that he hadn't spoken in years. And yet, he hadn't been able to walk away. Something stirred. A faint noise. A whimper. Before he could think, before he could even rationalize it, he was already moving. The smallest one, Amelia, stirred in her crib, her tiny fists clenching and unclenching as a soft cry escaped her lips. Adrian froze. He expected the staff to come, to soothe her, to fix the problem like they always did. But no one came. She cried again, and before he could stop himself, before logic could step in, his hands were already reaching, lifting her, cradling her against his chest. The moment she settled into his arms, the crying stopped. She nestled against him, tiny, warm, fragile. Adrian stood there, unmoving. This wasn't part of the plan. None of this was part of the plan. And yet, standing there in the dim light, holding a life so much smaller than his own, something shifted. Something he wasn't ready to name. Something that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Which continent are you listening to this story from? Why not share in the comments? We'd love to know. The world beyond the estate remained quiet, but Adrian knew better than to believe in silence. Victor Morrow was not a man who waited. 2 days had passed since the relocation, and while the walls of the safe house remained untouched, the air carried a tension that had settled into Adrian's bones. He had spent the better part of the day gathering intel, reaching out to old contacts, men who still owed him favors from a life he no longer acknowledged, and the news was clear. Victor was growing impatient. The official narrative was simple. Morrow denied everything. In public statements, he called the accusations slanderous fabrications, dismissing all ties to Black Serpent as misguided allegations from desperate enemies. On the surface, the world saw a wealthy businessman, a man who had outgrown the criminal underworld. But Adrian knew better. The silence wasn't hesitation. It was the quiet before the first strike. And if Morrow was preparing to act, Adrian had no intention of waiting. Evelyn found him outside that evening. The estate stretched far beyond the house itself, spilling into the wilderness. Tall pines, endless hills, and a sky that swallowed the world whole. The perimeter was guarded, every pathway lined with security measures, yet out here, away from the walls, away from the weight of decisions neither of them had wanted to make, there was an odd stillness. She hesitated before stepping closer. He didn't acknowledge her immediately, his gaze fixed on the tree line, his hands resting in his pockets. He had shed the layers of formality, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up, exposing the veins in his forearms, the faded scars that told stories Evelyn would never hear. But he didn't walk away when she joined him. And that was something. "I wanted to thank you," Evelyn said softly. Adrian didn't react at first. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, the sky shifting into deeper shades of twilight. Then, finally, "I didn't do it for you," he said, echoing his words from before. Evelyn exhaled, a quiet laugh escaping her lips, but there was no humor in it. "You keep saying that." His gaze flicked toward her, unreadable. She shook her head. "Maybe it's true. Maybe you're only doing this because it's convenient, or because you hate Victor more than you care about any of us. But you still did it. And for whatever it's worth, She hesitated, swallowing hard. "I know I don't deserve this." Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then his voice, low, steady, carrying the weight of something neither of them were willing to name. "You don't get to decide what you deserve." Evelyn looked at him then, really looked at him. But whatever she wanted to say, whatever emotion tightened in her throat, she left it unspoken. And Adrian, for once, didn't press for more. That night, Adrian made a decision. Evelyn had spent years running, hiding, surviving. But if Victor was coming, if this war was inevitable, then survival wouldn't be enough. She needed to fight. She needed to be ready. The training started the next morning. Evelyn barely had time to argue before Adrian was leading her to an empty wing of the estate, an old storage space converted into a private training area. The floors were padded, the walls reinforced, a space built for precision, for control. "This is unnecessary," she said, arms crossed, eyeing him warily. Adrian didn't humor her with a response. He tossed a training knife onto the mat between them. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I know how to defend myself." "Do you?" Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Because the last time you ran, you left 3 children in the woods." Her breath hitched. The words landed exactly as he intended. Cold, precise, a calculated cut. Rage flickered behind her eyes, but she didn't back down. Instead, she picked up the knife. "Fine," she said, her grip tightening around the handle. "Teach me." Adrian stepped forward, and he did. It wasn't kind. It wasn't gentle. Adrian didn't hold back. She expected hesitation, expected him to take into account that she was smaller, that she wasn't trained, that she had spent years as prey rather than predator. But Adrian Lancaster had never been the kind of man who believed in mercy. She lunged. He dodged. She struck again. He caught her wrist effortlessly, twisting her grip just enough to make her drop the knife. Evelyn swore, yanking back. Adrian let her, stepping away with practiced ease. "Your form is sloppy," he observed, voice calm. "Your stance is unbalanced, and you're leading with emotion instead of instinct." Evelyn's fists clenched. "This isn't some business deal, Adrian." "No," he agreed. "It's a fight. And if you keep fighting like this, you'll lose." She hated that he was right, but she hated Victor more. So she gritted her teeth, adjusted her stance, picked up the knife. And when she lunged again, this time, she didn't miss. By the time they stopped, Evelyn was exhausted. Her arms ached, her breathing was uneven, and she had lost count of how many times Adrian had knocked her off balance, forced her to recalibrate, to rethink, to react. But she had learned. She wasn't the same woman who had run from Victor in the dead of night, who had left her children behind because she had no other choice. She was something else now. Something sharper. Something that could fight. The estate was a fortress, but Adrian knew no fortress was unbreakable. Security rotations had been doubled. Surveillance feeds were monitored with precision that bordered on obsessive. No one entered or left without his explicit knowledge. And yet, Victor had found them. Adrian didn't believe in coincidences. There was a leak, a mole. Someone within his circle had sold them out. It started with a flicker in the security feed, a half-second of static, barely noticeable, easily dismissed. But Adrian noticed everything. His fingers moved over the control panel, switching between camera angles. The outer perimeter remained untouched, the main entrance locked down. And yet, the feeling in his gut, the instinct honed over years of survival, told him something was wrong. He didn't have to wait long for confirmation. Martin's voice crackled through his earpiece. "We've got movement. West side, near the ridge." Adrian's jaw tightened. "How many?" A pause. Then, 5. Maybe more. He exhaled slowly. Controlled, calculated. Victor wasn't sending an army. Not yet. This wasn't a siege. It was a test. A warning. A reminder that walls wouldn't protect them forever. Adrian pressed the comm link. "Take them out." Quietly. Outside, the night swallowed the estate in heavy silence. The intruders moved with practiced efficiency, men who had done this before, who knew how to kill in the dark. But Adrian's men were better. The first went down without a sound, a knife sliding between ribs, a body crumpling into the damp earth. The second had just enough time to register movement before a suppressed shot ended him. 3 left. Adrian watched from the security feed as Martin's team closed in. A brutal, surgical takedown, efficient, merciless, except one of them ran, not toward the fence, not toward an escape, toward the house, toward Evelyn. Evelyn had been in the study when she heard it, the distant pop of silenced gunfire, the faint tremor in the floorboards that told her something was wrong before she even processed the sound. She didn't run this time. Her fingers curled around the weight of the gun Adrian had placed in her hands 2 nights ago. She hadn't wanted it then. She hadn't thought she'd need it. Now she wasn't sure she'd survive without it. Footsteps, heavy, unfamiliar, coming closer. "Think, Evelyn." She moved quickly, pressing her back against the wall near the doorway, her breath steadying. The gun was cold, foreign in her grip, but she held it anyway. The footsteps stopped. A shadow stretched across the threshold. A man stepped inside. Not Adrian, not Martin, not one of theirs. He hadn't seen her yet. His attention was on the empty room, his body tense, his gun raised. Searching. Evelyn could hear the blood pounding in her ears. She had seconds to decide. Her hands were shaking. Her throat was dry. But she remembered Adrian's words. "Don't hesitate. If they get close enough to hesitate, you're already dead." She didn't think. She pulled the trigger. The gun kicked harder than she expected. The shot was messy, clumsy, but it hit. The man stumbled back, a strangled noise leaving his throat. Blood spread across his chest. He looked at her then, eyes wide, surprised, as if he hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her. Then slowly, he fell. Evelyn's breath came fast, uneven. She kept the gun raised, her arms locked, even as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. She had killed a man. She had killed a man. The thought crashed into her, heavy and violent. Then, another noise, footsteps, this time familiar. Adrian. He stepped into the room, his gun already drawn, his expression sharp, scanning the scene. His eyes landed on the body, then on Evelyn, and for the first time, she saw surprise in his gaze. She swallowed hard, her grip still tight on the gun. Her hands were trembling, but she didn't let go. Adrian stepped closer, slow and measured. He glanced at the body, then back at her. "Messy," he murmured. Evelyn let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob. I know. He studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he lowered the gun. She let him, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she'd be able to let go on her own, and Adrian, for the first time since this all began, didn't pull away. The attack didn't come at night. Victor wasn't the kind of man who waited for shadows to do his work. He wanted them to see him coming. He wanted them to feel the inevitability of his reach. It started with an explosion. The security alarms screamed through the estate as the south perimeter gate erupted in a fireball, sending debris flying, metal twisting, flames licking at the sky. Smoke billowed in thick plumes, cutting against the early morning light. Adrian had been expecting it. He was already in the security room when the blast registered, already issuing orders before Martin had even processed the sight on the surveillance feeds. They're coming in heavy, Martin muttered, eyes scanning the monitors, counting figures as they emerged from the tree line, moving fast, armed to the teeth. It wasn't a test this time. It was war. Adrian turned, grabbing the earpiece from the table, his voice sharp. All teams, defensive positions, keep them away from the house. His men moved like clockwork. Some took the rooftops, sniper rifles already lining up their shots. Others secured entry points, reinforcing the doors, positioning themselves behind cover. The estate wasn't just built to keep people out, it was built to hold the line. But Adrian knew Victor wouldn't send men just to die at the gates. This was a distraction, which meant the real fight was coming. Evelyn had already pulled the children into the lower levels. The panic room was reinforced steel, embedded deep within the structure, its walls built to withstand everything short of a nuclear blast. But that wasn't enough. She didn't trust locks. She didn't trust walls. She gripped the gun tightly in her hands, forcing her breath to steady, the memory of the man she had killed still fresh in her mind. She wouldn't hesitate again. The nannies held the children close, their whispers trying to soothe, trying to keep them from crying. Evelyn swallowed hard, kneeling beside them, brushing a hand over Amelia's soft curls. She wanted to promise them everything would be okay. But she wouldn't lie. Not now. The gunfire outside erupted in full. Adrian moved through the hallways like a man built for war, his every step measured, his gun gripped firmly in his hands. He didn't flinch at the sounds, didn't startle when the estate's glass shattered, when the scent of burning metal filled the air. His men were holding the perimeter, but it wasn't enough. The numbers were too many. Victor wasn't here to take prisoners. This wasn't about getting the children back. It was about erasing everything. Adrian reached the grand hall just as the inner doors burst open. 3 men entered, their rifles sweeping through the space, their movements controlled, tactical. But they weren't ready for him. Adrian moved first. A single shot to the first man's head, clean, precise. The second had enough time to turn before Adrian put a bullet through his throat. The third fired, but Adrian was already gone. He pivoted, moving low, closing the distance before slamming his elbow into the man's jaw, grabbing the rifle, turning it, and using it against him. 3 bodies, blood pooling across the marble floor. Adrian barely blinked. He turned toward the hallway, toward the panic room, toward them. Evelyn heard the footsteps before she saw them. She pressed herself against the wall, gun raised, breath held. The door slammed open. A man stepped in, and she fired. The bullet tore through his shoulder, sending him spinning back, crashing against the wall. He groaned, clutching at the wound, trying to reach for his gun. Evelyn didn't give him the chance. She fired again. This time he didn't move. Her hands were shaking, her breath ragged. But she didn't have time to process it, didn't have time to think, because another man entered. And this time, he got a shot off first. The impact hit her hard. She felt it before she heard it, the force slamming into her ribs, sending her staggering back, her knees hitting the floor. Pain exploded through her, sharp and unforgiving. She gasped, blinking rapidly, trying to push through the haze. The man lifted his gun again, and then Adrian was there. The shot came fast. The man didn't even get the chance to turn. His body crumpled before his brain could register what had happened. Adrian stepped over him without hesitation. His eyes locked onto Evelyn. She was slumped against the wall, blood seeping through her shirt, one hand clutching her side. Her breaths were too shallow. Adrian's heart roared in his chest. He dropped his gun, kneeling beside her. "Evelyn." His voice was low, steady, but she heard the urgency beneath it. She laughed weakly. "That bad?" He pressed his hand against the wound, forcing pressure. She flinched. "Stay awake." Her head tilted slightly, her breathing unsteady. "Kids?" "They're fine," Adrian said immediately. "You did good, but you have to stay awake." She exhaled, a trembling breath. "Hurts." Adrian's jaw locked. Something burned in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He had lost too much already. He wouldn't lose her, too. Not like this. He turned toward the doorway, toward the chaos still raging outside. He was done holding back. Adrian Lancaster had spent years burying the man he used to be. But tonight, he would become him again, and Victor Morrow would regret ever walking into his world. The bodies were still warm. Smoke curled through the broken hallways, the scent of gunpowder mixing with blood, burnt wood, and the sharp bite of adrenaline. Adrian moved through it all like a ghost. His men had secured most of the estate, but he wasn't stopping to count the dead. He had only one name left to cross off. Victor Morrow was here, and Adrian intended to end this. He found him near the east wing. Victor stood in the center of what had once been Adrian's personal study, surrounded by fallen men, some his own, some Adrian's. A fire crackled low in the hearth, the light casting shadows against the torn furniture and the shattered glass. He looked exactly as Adrian remembered. Sharp, controlled, dangerous. But this wasn't business anymore. This was personal. Victor turned, slow, deliberate, a pistol hanging lazily at his side. His lip curled into something amusing. "Took you long enough." Adrian didn't answer. He lifted his own gun, no hesitation, no words. He fired. Victor dodged at the last second, rolling to the side, taking cover behind a heavy oak desk. The bullet embedded deep splinters flying. Then he fired back. Adrian twisted, moving low, his shoulder slamming into a fallen bookcase for cover. The gunfire between them was quick and brutal, but neither of them missed on purpose. This wasn't a game. This was the last fight they would ever have. The shots stopped. Both men had one bullet left. The silence was deafening. Adrian shifted, stepping from behind the bookcase, his gun steady. Victor did the same, slow, measured. Two men standing in the wreckage of their choices. Adrian spoke first. "You should have stayed away." Victor laughed. Low, dark, edged with something that sounded almost genuine. "You and I both know that was never going to happen." Adrian's grip tightened. "You lost." Victor tilted his head slightly. "Did I?" His finger twitched toward the trigger. Adrian didn't hesitate. He fired. The bullet struck true, right through Victor's chest. Not messy, not rushed. A clean, fatal shot. Victor stumbled back. His knees buckled. He collapsed into the chair behind him, a shaking exhale slipping from his lips. Blood pooled, dark and spreading, staining the fine leather beneath him. His breathing slowed, but even as he died, he smiled. "You really think this ends with me?" Adrian said nothing. Victor chuckled, a wet, broken sound. Then he stilled. The light left his eyes. And just like that, it was over. Adrian exhaled slowly, lowering his gun. His hands weren't shaking. His heart wasn't racing. He had spent years imagining this moment. The day he would finally bury Victor Morrow. But as he stared at the lifeless body slumped in the chair, all he felt was tired. There were no celebrations in war, only what was left behind, and Adrian Lancaster, for the first time in his life, wasn't sure what came next. The storm had passed, but the wreckage remained. The once pristine halls of the estate were scarred with bullet holes, shattered glass, and the scent of blood that clung stubbornly to the air. The bodies had been cleared, the fires put out, but the war lingered in the silence. Adrian stood in the center of it all, unmoving. Victor was dead. The threat was gone. But as Adrian turned toward the grand staircase, his gaze drifting toward the lower levels, he knew the real battle had just begun. Evelyn never made it out of the operating room. The moment the fight had ended, Adrian had carried her himself, ignoring the protests, the outstretched hands, the voices telling him that they could handle it. Number. She had fought for them. She had bled for them. And if she was going to die, she wouldn't die in the hands of strangers. But even Adrian Lancaster, with all his wealth, his power, his control, couldn't stop fate. He had been outside when it happened. Standing in the rain, listening to the quiet, listening to nothing. Then the door opened. He knew before the doctor even spoke. The way he hesitated, the way his eyes softened, the way he lowered his voice as if it would somehow lessen the weight of the words. "I'm sorry." Adrian didn't move. He didn't respond. He just stood there as the truth settled into his bones. They buried her in the mountains. The same mountains she had once been forced to run through. The same ones where she had finally found safety. The same ones where, in the end, she gave everything to protect what she loved. Adrian had made the arrangements himself. No press, no speeches, no crowds, just him and 3 children too young to understand what they had lost. The wind howled through the valley as he stood over the grave, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. He hadn't spoken since it happened, not to Martin, not to the staff, not even to himself. But now, staring at the freshly turned earth, at the stone that bore her name, he finally broke the silence. "You won." The words were quiet, almost bitter. "You said you didn't care what happened to you, as long as they were safe." He exhaled, slow and steady. "You got what you wanted, Evelyn." But he wasn't sure if she had won anything at all. The days passed, but time didn't move the same way it used to. The house had changed, not in the way it looked, but in the way it felt. The security measures remained, the walls still stood, but the air inside was different, lighter somehow, quieter, not empty, just waiting. Adrian caught himself lingering near the nursery, watching them sleep. It was a habit now, a ritual he hadn't meant to form. Every night, after the staff retired, after the world outside fell into silence, he would find himself there, watching, listening, reminding himself why he was still here. One night, Noah stirred. His small face scrunched, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling as if searching for something unseen. Adrian hesitated. Then, before he could think too much about it, he stepped inside. The floorboards didn't creak, the shadows didn't shift, the world didn't end. He reached down, adjusting the blanket. Noah's tiny hand grasped onto his sleeve, curling around the fabric, holding on without thought. Adrian froze. His breath hitched, his fingers twitched, and for the first time in years, he didn't pull away. The world still turned. The threats still existed. Victor was gone, but his words weren't. "You really think this ends with me?" Adrian didn't. He knew better than anyone that men like Victor didn't operate alone. That power didn't die with a single bullet. There would be more. There would always be more. But as he stood on the balcony that night, looking out over the dark horizon, hearing the faint sound of children breathing in the room behind him, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, not for revenge, not for power, but for them, for a future worth protecting, for a war that wasn't over. Not yet. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.